of these push-pull policies in some cases. So what that means is that, if you go to, say, the Department of Defense, that obviously has a very large budget through DARPA, and has some great examples of success there, they're able to fund the fund the researchers and fund that piece of it. But then they're also able to come forward as a significant customer who basically says, okay, we want, a widget or something that does this. These are the specifications that we need. And if you can make it, we'll buy it in massive quantities, basically. And they're able to do that then also, one of the things that they do well that I think we would do well to imitate more in Canada is large fractions or small amounts of funding, but at a high percentage to some of these more early stage innovations. And that's something that we've struggled with in Canada. There is often this desire to say, and it's understandable where it comes from. So, government shouldn't be subsidizing industry. And so we should have always, industry should always have skin in the game. And so, we're going to fund things, but we're only going to fund them at 50-50, say, for example. And for innovators, especially at the small scale, raising that, what is effectively small amounts of money, but can be very difficult if you're far from market with those things. And so that's one where, in the US, what they do with for example, the SBIR program is actually give, much higher percentages of funding in these small amounts to people. And then if they are successful and, go on to the next stage, so it's not willy-nilly, people aren't standing around just throwing money out the door. But they're also not using, this kind of co-funding as the only tool in ensuring proper use of funds. And and that is, in the AOSTRA story, I think is really interesting because, so AOSTRA, the organization that was really instrumental in unlocking the in situ oil sand production in Alberta, they had a model similar to this of 50-50 funding between industry and government. And a lot of the money that was spent by the organization was spent in that way. But one of the really critical, first piloting and test of what we all now know as SAGD actually didn't have any industry funding when it happened. And they went to industry, and for a number of different reasons, they said, we're not interested. And they decided to go ahead in any way. And then later actually went back and industry bought in sort of retroactively. So it's also a little bit, you have to dig a bit to see that this is what happened. But that's exactly, I think it's an interesting example that in that case, it was exactly that, fully government funded piece that was really one of the critical pieces in moving that technology forwards. And it comes back to really well understood examples of market failure where, especially if you're testing sort of a concept, the patent system and the intellectual property system isn't going to be sufficient for the person who's making that investment to recover the value completely.
I want to bring up I don't want to call it a phenomenon or a stage in the development process from lab to commercialization and full-scale commercialization. There's something called the Valley of Death. And so I'm going to illustrate it with partial upgrading technology, partial upgrading of bitumen. So if you upgrade bitumen from a molasses into a medium or heavy crude that will flow in a pipeline, you can free up to 30% of the space in an existing pipeline that's shipping dilbit. This is an enormous benefit to the industry potentially, and solves all kinds of problems and makes the economics of oil sands better. And but there's a valley of death. So 10 companies have got technologies in this, and to go from either the lab or a pilot to full-scale commercialization, that's where they can't get money. And that's where the Notley government had brought in the $2.1 billion partial upgrading technology, was to bridge the valley of death. And then the Kenney government killed it because they said it was too risky. But that's a perfect example of the kind, is it not, Sara, of the kind of work or kind of involvement that the government could have that has all sorts of benefits down the road.
Yeah, and it's any individual case you have to look into the details of. to decide the merits of the specific project. I'm actually not as familiar with the partial upgrading as a technology, so it's harder for me to comment on that one. But indeed, the idea of how do you bridge that, and what's the right tool for government. So I was talking about the grants and the need to provide actually just direct funding. As you get further down the innovation cycle, so to speak, you need typically larger amounts of money. You may have people that are willing to put up some money, but then you run into challenges around information for investors, sort of just behavioral issues where investors, many aren't interested to step out away from the crowd for various reasons. And so there, government with things like loan guarantees and other financing tools can really play a big role in unlocking, capital coming in. And you see, I think there's an interesting example around, if you compare kind of the trajectory of the shale oil and gas and renewables over the past decade or so, and just how much easier in some sense it was for the shale industry to actually raise a lot of financing, even though, at the end of the day, there's I think we're seeing now some serious questions, even pre-pandemic, about the viability of that industry in the long term. And in contrast, what a large hill there was for the renewable energy industry to climb. And they were ultimately successful coming out of the last recession in the US. There was actually the loan guarantee program from the Department of Energy that was really, provided a lot of funding. It also provided funding to Tesla and many others. But it just shows you that, particularly when we're talking about things that are more new, that's where, our market systems for funding have the hardest time, and fair enough, right? Because how, as an investor, it's hard to differentiate between, something that is the next wind and solar and something that is the next, cold fusion, right? So how do you do that well? Well, one way you can do that well is, having groups of experts who are, really looking at things from that expert perspective, and not from the perspective of necessarily, trying to make the investments themselves, but that can be, say, advising a government around the technical viability of different options. And then just that one other thing that I would mention about that too, because it comes up quite a bit. People have probably heard of the Solyndra story that doesn't die, right? And this idea that, sometimes when you make these loan guarantees or fundings, it doesn't work, right? And that is sometimes put forward as like this big aha, like, oh, well, here's an example of one bit of money that, was lost and wasn't returned. But of course, one has to see it in the context of the whole program, right? So in the case of Solyndra, in the context of the whole loan guarantee program, which was actually wildly successful in its returns. But just more generally, usually, we wouldn't look at someone who we see as a great investor in the private market and point to one example where they lost money and say, well, that proves that, they're no good at all, right? It typically actually what happens with these government programs is when you look at them retroactively, their failure rate tends to actually be almost too low, indicating that they're not taking enough risk. So, it's something obviously always need to be very careful with the use of public money. But a characterization, that's saying, oh, well, this is just wasting a bunch of money is not actually, what's going on.
Last question, Sara, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And there's been a fair amount of investment in innovation in Alberta, in Canada, generally around energy. Are we doing enough? And are we investing in the right industries, the right technologies, the right people, that kind of thing?
Mm-hmm. The enough is a really hard question to answer, right? Is what's the right number? That often comes up in Twitter debates. So, it's is this, or it's 5 times this, or is it 100? But I think one thing that is really clear is thinking about, where it's going and what you're trying to achieve with that, right? So you have this constant pull between, on the one hand, it needs to be close enough to the industries that you have and the kind of infrastructure and talent and knowledge that you have within a region that it's going to be relevant. but it needs to be far enough away from industry at the same time that it's not just serving what are the nearest term kind of business needs that people see. And so, if anything, I think that in Alberta, there's also cycles, right? So like we had a period of, okay, so SAGD was figured out, and then the industry went through this long period of working to optimize that technology, and that's where a lot of the public funding was directed to as well. And there's certainly a logic to that. But then there comes a point when you say, okay, if we really need to think about pushing beyond this, then it needs to go into things that are more different, right? Which is not to then say, well, you just pick something out of the blue and we should do that because it sounds good, but trying to look at, these adjacent competencies, adjacent industries and looking at what are the skills that we have, less from a kind of within the industry perspective and more almost, if you were to describe them, what else could you build, like a set of Legos out of what we have. And so that's where I think that, we need to be doing more of that going forward.
Excellent. Well, Sean has got his hand up, so let me unmute you, Sean, and ask your question.
Thanks very much. Hi, Sarah. Thanks very much for doing this. And you touched on something that I've heard a lot about, but it tends not to get the focus that the investing side gets. And that is, what's your market? How do you pull as opposed to simply push? And your example of the Defense Department is a very good one. We don't have that in Canada, that kind of massive public sector buyer. We do have governments that are buyers. So how do you see that in the Canadian context? Who can play that role, and both at the public level, but then talking about the oil and gas sector, I've heard over the years concerns that the industry itself is maybe not as open to being a buyer of technology and technology solutions as it might be. So, a very important, it's great to, one of the reasons that valley of death exists is that the other side can look like a barren landscape in terms of market.
Yeah, it's a great question. And indeed, we don't have the same military industrial complex that the US has, nor do, that's probably not the right answer for us. So what can happen? Government can play that role within other areas, right? And so one of the things there is to make sure that the way that government is approaching procurement, there's some kind of principles that are set from a higher level within government that are meant to drive those types of outcomes. So, for example, typically government procurement would be very risk adverse against trying new things because there's a large penalty for failure. And so, if you have a leadership that's setting a direction that says, no, we want to make sure that we are procuring, or we're setting aside a certain portion, say, of our procurement to target, new innovations, and then sets the incentives that reflect that. That's one way that government can do that. Another key driver is flexible regulations, right? So regulations that say, you have to basically reach this target for methane emissions or for whatever sector you want to talk about. So it's not being prescriptive in terms of, this is the technology you need to use, but it's more prescriptive than simply say a price on carbon where you're maybe not overcoming that market failure that is beyond just the kind of cost incentive, but you're actually saying, okay, you've got to solve this problem. It's up to you how you do it, but that helps also to create that pull as well. So again, yeah, that it's a really important piece. If you kind of try to approach innovation as a government only with with one component of the whole thing, you're either going to end up failing or spending a lot more to get what you want out of it. And then the other one that I would point to would be to say, well, where where does Canada have trusted partners, right? And how can the Canadian government and the kind of export funding work to also meet, say, the needs of the U.S. government, if they're being a big procurer of some kind of technology. And that's one that I think is, if I take the example of, the metals and minerals of the energy transition, I think the U.S. is increasingly concerned about their reliance on China for, these materials that are going to become increasingly critical for the economy. And so I think that's one where, some kind of outside of the market or in addition to the market agreements could be reached.
Right.
Sara, I have before we get to the Raf and Maggie, I have a question for you on this follow-up. The oil and gas companies and their corporate culture is very odd, in the sense that, in the one hand, it innovates a lot, and it can be seen as innovative, but within that structure, it's very risk averse, and it's very reluctant to take, because as you point out, the risk of failure is very high. If you're an engineer looking at some new technology for a well, and that blows up in your face, and it's a $10 million failure, that could be your career. It would certainly be, it's a big problem. So the industry tends to be very, very reluctant. Who did it first? They don't want to be, nobody wants to be the first.
Everyone wants to be second.
Yeah, exactly. Prove it out and then come and talk to me. So around the energy, as we're pivoting over to this low carbon, how can government help those companies to be more innovative while still not taking on excessive risk?
So I think there's sort of two parts to that. One is to really provide directly things like, innovation sandboxes in places where technology can be proven at scale, right? So, the AOSTRA parallel there would be the underground test facility. They built, the government of Alberta had its own resource that they built out. So how do you find, ways to really allow people to show that it works at scale? The flip side of that is, pushing a little bit on that risk adverse culture, because, I think you can go from both sides. And that's where those regulations coming in can really make a difference. Because if you basically just kind of say, well, no, now you've got to do something, then you start to change that risk calculus internally. And, the leadership of the oil and gas company says, well, okay, we've got to solve this thing. So, go and figure that out. And when there are failures, at least people aren't asking, well, why did you do this at all? There was a clear reason that they were trying to meet that. So I think both of those, again, are good ways to kind of help address that risk.
That's a really good answer. I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, Raf, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, hello. So I was just wondering how Alberta compares to other provinces in terms of government investment in research and development. How do we compare to other provinces in Canada? That's the question.
Yeah, good question. So I guess I should caveat this, that also that I sit on the board of Emissions Reduction Alberta. So I have views on that organization. Alberta has actually historically invested quite a bit, especially at a provincial level, in research and innovation, right? And you see that going back to, the Stelmach government increasing funding for universities, and the Alberta Innovates, and there are many different structures where there is, significant investment, or it has been previously. Obviously, things are constantly shifting, so I think that's something to watch going forwards. And then the other thing is, in recent years, or in sort of going back over the last decade or so, a lot of our investment, has been very closely tied to some of the less disruptive innovations within the oil sector. And I think that, as we sort of enter a new phase where there are bigger questions about the 10 to 20 year future for the industry, there's a rebalancing of, of course, it's an industry that will continue to generate cash and will continue to operate and, should be optimized. But when we're looking for those really kind of disruptive new industry creating innovations, there needs to be additional attention elsewhere also.
Okay, hang on a second, Maggie. I'm just trying to unmute you and
unmute myself.
Thank you for doing that. Not very often you mute yourself, so I really appreciate it.
Oh yeah, rub it in, rub it in.
Go ahead.
So, all right. You know, just my observation, I guess, is that, you know, in Canada, we are pretty darn innovative, and we build these little companies, and we patent things, and we get IP, and then things just kind of grind to a halt. And you know, you're talking about barriers, and you know, what I see is a lot of times our hard-won, government-supported in cases, a lot of cases, ideas and tech just gets sold to the UK and Germany and the United States, and the IP just goes with it. And those guys build that up and make a shit ton full of money on it. So you know, I've been, what is it? You know, there's probably a consortium of things that are against this, but I think one of the things is our population. We don't have a big population, and that you might need more people in your country just to scale something. I would like thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair observation. And I mean, there's certainly, you know, really interesting research kind of looking into the dynamics of innovation and the importance of having, you know, that kind of two-way interaction between customers and innovators that is challenging for a smaller country like Canada to do. So, you know, what do we do other than throwing our hands up about it? I mean, I think one of the things that I mentioned earlier, so that, you know, making funding available, more sort of direct funding available at the small scale, is one thing that I think, you know, sometimes you hear that drain is coming, you know, early on because people are just not able to find that, you know, second tranche of money to kind of start to move things. So that I think is one piece of it. There's some other interesting work that has been going on, or at least proposals around different ways for government to kind of recover the value of the investments that they make in innovation, right? And I think that may be very relevant for a country like Canada, where, as you say, you know, it may be that some of the IP ends up leaving. You know, historic or traditionally, the idea is that, well, you know, government invests the public money, and then the public return comes through creation of jobs and tax base and all those things. But there is a push by some to say, well, you know, if government is really acting almost like a VC in this early stage, you know, maybe they should take a more VC-like investment in the technology that's produced, right? And actually hang on to some of that IP that could eventually make returns. So, you know, there's not a lot of great examples of how that works in practice, and there's challenges with it as well. Not to make everything about it go back to AOSTRA, but actually in that example, the government did hang on to onto the IP, and that was quite contentious, you know, in the beginning to get companies to agree to that. And I think it's a fair question of, would you really manage to do that again today? It did return money. It didn't return quite as much as, you know, they had maybe thought. Obviously, I think more economic activity has come from the industry itself. But another important thing that it can actually do is help ensure that the technology actually gets disseminated and used, right? And so, you know, often when we fund companies and allow them to create the IP and then to own that, there is, you know, some kind of requirements for dissemination or IP, you know, sharing with patents, you know, with pay. But even with that, if there's not actually a focused effort to do that, and you can look back and see that, you know, AOSTRA and the government actually spent a fair amount of money. They had to put money in to like get the technology out, right, in a sense, to sell the patent. And so there's sort of different ways that we could think about government keeping that IP and that being a different way to have a return on investment that may, as you say, actually be even more important when you're looking at a smaller country like Canada, where the likelihood that you know, is deployed elsewhere may be greater. So that's you know, very much not something that's solved, but I think an interesting avenue for further consideration.
Great. Okay, we're going to do Gerry Hanford. So Gerry, let me just unmute you, or you unmute yourself.
Then everyone's muted.
I see you, Brian. You're up next. Okay, hang on a second. There we go. Gerry, ask your question, please.
So I have you've kind of touched on it, but just let me preface my question. In one of the papers you did a couple of years ago, back to the AOSTRA example, and I thought pretty striking in you commented that Lougheed saw, and others around him, I'm sure at the time, that we had this huge untapped resource in Alberta that was not, we were not able to get our hands on by conventional technologies at the time. And at that time, I think they saw the industry was running out of oil and gas in 10 or 15 years, and we had this 80% of the world's of our reserves untouchable. And so he had the vision, and the comment you made, the vision and the foresight to see we need to do something about it. And nobody was in a position from an industry to tackle such a big problem. So which leads me to my question, and we've been talking about different ways the governments can do it, but do we have in today's society, not just Alberta, Canada, and around the world, do we have this trend toward short-termism thinking in our governments? Do we have the long-term vision and ability of governments, whichever they are, to kind of pick these broad mission-like goals and mobilize resources toward it? So it's a question, do we have the leadership to do that at the highest level?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I hope so, I guess, is part of my answer. I think it's both to make the challenge even more challenging. I would actually add to that, you know, a lot of the missions that people like to point to, like putting a man on the moon or the Manhattan Project, they were actually easier in some ways than some of the missions that we're talking about today, because they didn't face the barrier of, you know, an incumbent industry that was going to be disrupted by success, right? So I guess I'm saying that, you know, we have it even harder than the previous missions that we had before. I think there is, you know, at the same time, there's encouraging signs and I think a growing recognition of the, you know, the need to go there, right? And I think you see a bit of a rising call, you know, if you look across, I think there was an op-ed either yesterday or today from somebody in the oil field service sector, you know, talking about the kind of need to innovate. You know, one of the other early signs that I found interesting, I heard that even this is going back maybe a year or two ago, the enrollment in the petroleum engineering program at the university I think in Calgary and maybe in Alberta, but anyway, somehow the enrollments were generally down quite dramatically, right? So I think there's a conversation that's going on publicly, but I think there is a growing recognition that you can see in these different metrics that there really is, you know, this is really a different time and we do need to move forward. So yeah, so I guess I'm hopeful, but it's a significant challenge, I would say.
Okay, Brian, who hasn't been able to find his little blue hand button, you're up next.
So there's my blue hand. Well, just by FYI, I spent 12 years on the University of Alberta board, 6 years of which I was chairman of the board. And so Sara talks about a number of things, and certainly, you know, the vision that Mr. Lougheed had in terms of setting together a number of these funds. I was in that underground AOSTRA facility many years ago and that sort of thing. But I think the part that I'd like to narrow in on, we had the Alberta Ingenuity Fund, which was the Science and Engineering Fund. And at the University of Alberta, and I'm sure at the University of Calgary, that enabled us to have a lot of fabulous projects with the various oil sand operators and whatnot. And the gap between bench findings and implementing them in the field was next to zero, because often we had Syncrude, Suncor, various staff members right in our labs, out they would go. So process, process management, tailings management, settling, getting rid of the tailings pond, processing, and that. So we had all of that aspect was working well. And the other one I would just, as a sidebar.
And do it quickly, please.
Yeah, okay. So Sara, your comment, they collapsed the Ingenuity Fund. They collapsed all these various funds. And as a result, many of these projects died, and they were providing phenomenal results.
Yeah, and I think getting that, one of the other fine lines that you have to walk, I think, with funding university research is you want to, you want to have it, some of it at least, somehow linked to ultimately things that you can deploy. But at the same time, you don't want the universities to become
Oops, Sarah's frozen up. I was really interested in listening to her answer. Hopefully what she's got is just a short-term internet connection. I know this happens to me occasionally, is you get Zoom gives you a message that you've got a poor quality connection, and you come back in 10, 15, 20 seconds. Oh, she's signed out. Here she is, back again.
There we go. Let's see. Is that better?
Yes.
Not sure what happened there. So yeah, what I was saying was around this concept of, with the universities and funding research, there's a balance to maintain between, doing fundamental research that is going to lead to future discoveries, but, making sure that you're not only doing fundamental research, but at the same time that the universities and the researchers aren't simply becoming the R&D arm that's totally driven by industry. And my sense is that we've swung a bit far to one side, and it's always a little harder to justify the more basic research or the more, kind of intellectual freedom. But, maybe I'm showing my bias as a scientist, but I think that's where, a lot of these new ideas also come from, is when you let people who want to just kind of go, gee, I wonder, how this thing works, spend time doing that, as opposed to, only focused in on, kind of one specific applied problem.
Okay, Dave, you're up next. So let's get you unmuted. There we go. Ask your question, please.
Anyways, it's funny because this train of thought's going where my brain was going. I think money has to be put into basic STEM research and basic STEM programs at high school, post-secondary. Like the feds announced, what, 15 million for Vito Intervac in Saskatoon to look at coronavirus. How many people are walking the street that can go comfortably into an L3 lab right now? Not a whole lot. And I really think that the research in the basic sciences, the good things happen, nothing too prescriptive, because we want these random, incredibly bright people doing stuff all over the world to solve it. And then getting back to energy real quick, who was on last week, Markham, that did a co-op solar farm? Remember? Someone was.
Oh, it was one of our guests, and they were new, and it's not on the tip of my tongue.
But I think what's happening with technology, the way it's going, I mean, I'm a retired IT guy. We did a nowhere Manitoba. I live in nowhere land. I can pull. Dave,
if I can just interrupt, I wanted to get Sara out by 10.
Sure. Yeah, no problem.
Quick. If you could ask your question.
Nope. No, that was just basically it. More comment. How does she see sort of the local communities getting together and pushing energy change and things like that, because that technology is now there.
Mm-hmm. So community solar type projects,
things like that.
Yeah. I think the different countries have taken different approaches to that piece of the energy transition and how much ownership has gone to local communities. Unfortunately in Alberta, that kind of stalled out. There was this plan to launch community generation programs, and I know there's been some specific examples where it's gone forward, but it's a real challenge within Alberta just because of the ways that our electricity market is kind of structured and set up. So I think if the tweaks are made to allow for it, there's a real opportunity there, and it has some multiple benefits, because it does also, obviously it can generate investment and jobs and all those things that we need, but it also gives people, I think, a different relationship to energy when you know, they see this stuff and they have ownership over it, and as well. So, you know, a lot of potential there, but some tweaks are needed to make it work.
Well, Sara, we're going to let you go now. Thank you very much for doing this. We really appreciate it. Great insights and all sorts, as a journalist, all sorts of interesting stories for me to follow up on. So I'll be emailing you shortly.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day, folks.
Thanks for
for coming in. Bye-bye.